Hello everyone, it will be my pleasure to discuss with you the impact of animal-sourced foods and animal agriculture on global health, more specifically the risks of pandemics and epidemics. So a bit of context, my name is Cynthia Schuck. I'm a zoologist. I also worked on global health for 10-15 years, together with Dr. Vladimir Alonso. He's also a zoologist and epidemiologist. We worked for several institutes such as the WHO, the NIH in the United States, and other independent research organizations. We also published a number of papers on topics on global health, on pandemics, epidemics, the efficacy of vaccines, pandemic preparedness, respiratory diseases, infectious diseases, and so on. And in the last 5 to 6 years, we returned to our academic origins and have been now working on animal welfare, specifically the health and welfare of farmed animals. So this is where a lot of the information I will be discussing comes from. If by the end of this talk anyone is interested in further information or the scientific references for the things that I'll be discussing, I suggest going to one of these references or both. One is the Routledge Handbook of Animal Welfare. It's open access. The address is in this link. You can see in the slide, tiny URL, etc. And there we have a book chapter, Animal Health, Animal Welfare and Global Health, where a lot of the information I'll be discussing is explained in more detail. And the booklet, Pandemics, Global Health and Consumer Choices, which is also free and can be downloaded at the welfarefootprint.org/global health address. So before starting, I'd like to comment on some very good things about global health that happened over the last centuries and decades, and that paradoxically may be changing for the worse in the next decades. So here we have a chart with the life expectancy from 1770 to 2021. And what we see is that there was a massive increase in life expectancy in the next few decades. In 1950, life expectancy was less than 40 years of age. And now we have most places in the world with a life expectancy above 70 years of age. So this was due to a number of reasons. But one of them was the decrease in the rate of mortality due to infectious diseases. In the past, many children under the age of 5 died of several infectious diseases, and through a number of changes that I'll be discussing, this change for the better. So there's this general increase in life expectancy. Naturally, if people are living longer and dying less, then you have an increase in the population number. So here you have the world population growth over the last 300 years with a projection to 2100. And what we see in the green area is that there was this massive increase in the number of people living on this planet. In the last 5 to 6 decades, we jumped from 2.5 billion people in 1950 to 8 billion people now, with a forecast of 11 billion in 2100. So together with this increase in life expectancy, the technological revolution, the explosion in the world population, there was a very radical transformation in the way we produce food and in the way we produce animal-sourced foods. There was a nearly complete replacement of traditional practices in animal agriculture. So what many people still think when they think of farmed animals, animals on pasture, free range, etc., by industrial processes. So in this picture you can see what is a very typical facility for raising animals. At the top you see a lagoon with the waste from these animals. And here in this graph you can see the yearly number of animals slaughtered for meat in the world, just land animals, fish are not included. We jumped from less than 10 billion in 1960 to over 70 billion in 2020. So a massive increase in the number of animals slaughtered for their food. And this increase in the number of animals slaughtered for their food is not only because there is more people in the world, but because people are eating much more meat. So here I have per capita meat consumption by type of meat in 2019 in various countries, and you can see that while in the past meat was eaten occasionally on weekends, on a Sunday, or just to season some recipes, now it's the main dish in many countries and eaten sometimes 3 times a day. So in various countries you have over 100 kilos of meat eaten per person per year. So this is all in between 300 and 400 grams of meat per day, every day. Now, along with these explosions in the number of animals, the number of people on the planet, what we are also witnessing in the last decades is an increase in the frequency of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases at a global scale. So one new infectious disease is recognized every 4 months on average, and most of these diseases are zoonotic. Zoo from animals, so which means they are originated in animals. So both wild animals, bats, and many different types of wild animals, and domesticated farm animals that we're in more close contact with. Now, this relative increase in the frequency of infectious diseases that are emerging again or re-emerging is concerning, because different from the past, where populations were more or less isolated, nowadays we have this huge network of communication across the globe. So if you have an infectious disease that is transmissible from person to person, it can reach all corners of the globe very quickly. This is the global map of air transportation routes, and it's easy to see why some local public health problems are now global health problems. We saw this in many large epidemics and pandemics recently. Now, with this in mind, I'll start discussing the topic of pandemics and epidemics and why this matters for these two global health risks. Now, in this map, we have many of the pandemics and epidemics of the last century and their origins. And what you can see is that many of them are traced back to the capture and production of animals for consumption. So, for example, this is the case of the outbreaks of Ebola in Africa and SARS in 2003 and 4. Both are traced back to the consumption of wild animals, one more in a more natural environment, another one in a live animal market in a larger city. You have the cases of swine flu in 2009, which was a pandemic, many of you may remember. The many outbreaks of bird flu and so on. Now, how do the pathogens that are circulating on wildlife, in wild animals, are transmitted to the human populations? How do they spill over to the human populations? Well, there are many possible routes. One of them, for example, is through mosquitoes, ticks, and so on. This is the case of many infectious diseases such as Zika, chikungunya, malaria, and so on. Another means is by being in touch with contaminated water and food. This is a common mean as well. But one important thing is that if the transmission of this pathogen is not possible from person to person, you need to get in touch with the mosquito, with the vector that transmitted the disease, or with the contaminated source, water, food, etc., then the likelihood that this will become a pandemic is reduced because it's restricted to the area where the contaminated source is, or to the area where the vector, the mosquito, the tick, circulates. So, for example, in the case of malaria, it doesn't become, widespread globally because the mosquito is restricted to relatively warm areas, tropical areas. So you'll not have malaria in a temperate or cold zone, and it's not transmitted from person to person. So diseases transmitted in this way are less likely to become very severe epidemics or pandemics. Now, nowadays, we cannot ignore the risks associated with the release of pathogens from the laboratory. This is a risk that has been considered by many epidemiologists for some time. This is a consensus statement from the Cambridge Working Group about the risks associated with the study of highly lethal pathogens on the laboratory and the creation of potentially pandemic pathogens. And the concern is associated with the failability of even the best laboratories in countries like the US and other European countries. An investigation that was conducted on the frequency of incidents, breaches of biosecurity protocol, found that on average there were 2 incidents per week, even in the most secure labs. And highly lethal pathogens were involved in some cases, and actually there were escapes of pathogens in some cases as well. So this is a risk that must be taken seriously nowadays. Another possible route of contamination is the capture of wild animals for consumption. So here's an illustration for the case of Ebola, which is traced back to the consumption of bats in some parts of Africa. It's not the actual eating, the consumption of the cooked meat of the bat that is a problem, but being in touch with the fluids, with the blood of the bat. So if these fluids, if the blood, which contains the pathogen, gets in touch with the mucosa, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, or with a wound in the skin that gets in touch with the human blood, then the pathogen can be transmitted either directly to a person that gets in touch with the bat, the infected bat. Not all bats have the infection, or intermediate hosts, both wild animals and farm animals that may have been in touch with the fluids or blood of this, or contaminated fruits eaten by those animals. 2 more pictures of people in contact with the meat of wild animals captured for consumption. And some people have the impression that this is a practice, the capture and consumption of wild animals, that is practiced in remote regions, in more natural regions, or by more vulnerable populations, but it's not necessarily the case. So, for example, a few years ago, the volume of bushmeat traded in the Congo Basin was about 5 million tons of meat, which is a lot, and not necessarily consumed by poor people. So in some places, bush meat is seen as a delicacy, a gourmet thing. So the economic development of a region may not necessarily lead to a reduction or abolition of these practices. You also have the sale of wild animals on large cities in famous live animal markets or wet markets, which are more abundant in Asia, but also are present in other countries, in other continents, in Africa, in the Americas, and so on. And the risks associated with these markets are many. First of all, there is a high diversity of pathogens from different populations that are put together on these markets, sometimes from various species. You also have a situation of acute stress for the animals. Many times they are live, and you have the animals on cages without water, without food, with noise. Sometimes they're hurt, very poor sanitary conditions, so the waste of the animals gets all mixed. They are slaughtered sometimes on site, so you have a mixture of waste and blood. And in situations of acute stress, there's typically immune suppression, so the immune system of the animals is weakened, and this gives opportunity for the pathogens to multiply very rapidly and to be shed, to be liberated on this waste in high amounts. So you have a high amount of pathogens from various species, various populations. They can meet, they can recombine their genetic material, and at the same time you have hosts from the human population there which can be infected by this pathogen. So the proper condition for the emergence of novel pathogens and their transmission to the human populations are found in these markets. The same logic applies to the wildlife trade. So in this case, wild animals that are traded not necessarily as food, but as pets, for their skin and for other uses. And in this case, you also have the animals being sent in journeys that can last several days or weeks, usually in brutal conditions. Many perish on the journeys, and those that survive are under a situation of acute pain, fear, and distress. So their immune systems are also weakened, and given the possibility that any pathogen they have may multiply very rapidly, may be liberated very rapidly, and transmit a disease. And also these animals sometimes are sent to very distant places, so taking, this reservoir of pathogens, spreading it across everywhere where the animal is traded. Now there's a last route that I'd like to discuss, which has been increasingly considered as the main risk of a major pandemic or epidemic spreading in the human population, which is the transmission of pathogens through the farm animals that we raise for consumption, mostly chickens and pigs. I think it will become clear in a few slides that the way animals are raised and traded nowadays represents a major threat to human health and well-being, and that many of the conditions that translate into poor animal health and welfare are also a threat to public health. Now, why is intensive animal farming or industrial animal farming, which is the way in which we overwhelmingly raise animals for their food nowadays, why does it represent a major pandemic and epidemic risk? Well, first of all, livestock species now have more biomass, more weight than all their wild relatives combined. So, for example, in the case of birds, all the weight of birds on the planet, 70% is of farm birds, so broiler chickens, laying hens, turkeys, and so on, and only 30% is of wild birds. With mammals, 60% of the weight of mammals on the planet is of farmed mammals. 36% of the weight is from the human population, and only 4% of wild mammals. So this huge mass and number of animals represents a massive reservoir of pathogens of virus and bacteria that can spill over to the human population, and that is in relatively closer contact with the human population than wild animals. In addition to the higher probability of being infected by a pathogen from a farmed animal just because there's a huge number of them, also, and perhaps even more importantly, the ideal conditions for the emergence and transmission of zoonotic diseases are found in housing systems such as this one on the picture that involve the confinement of a large number of animals. So in the case of broiler chickens, for example, chickens raised for their meat, you have installation facilities with 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 animals together. Here, a facility with pigs raised for their meat. Also, this is a high density. The animals are in close contact. So if a pathogen emerges or an animal gets infected by a pathogen in these places, transmission from one animal to the other is just very rapidly. It's almost immediate. In addition to the high number of farmed animals on the planet and the high concentration, the confinement of huge populations inside closed facilities, there's also another factor that facilitates the emergence of novel pathogens and their transmission to the human population, which is intensive selection for fast growth and high productivity. So this is the picture of a broiler chicken raised for their meat in 1957 at 56 days of age, not even 1 kilo. Then in 1978 and 2005 with over 4 kilos at the same age. So there was a over 400% increase in the weight of the chicken in just a few decades. And what that has to do with infectious diseases and pandemics? Well, the following. When selection is almost exclusively focused on fast growth and productivity, the energy that would be dedicated to the development of important organs, important physiological functions, is diverted to growth of muscle mass and to productivity. So there's less energy available for the immune function, for example, that gets weakened. Also, the many important organs of the animal, such as the heart, the lungs, the joints, do not keep pace with the fast growth of the muscles. And so you have, like shown in the picture, overworked lungs. The lungs do not have the capacity they should have. You have a very vulnerable cardiac system, and so on. So an animal like this would not be viable if left alone in nature to survive. It's just a machine grown to achieve the highest mass possible in the shortest possible time. They are slaughtered with about 40 something days, and when they're very young. If they pass that age, then they start dying. So you have a number of problems associated with this fast growth, including over-inflammatory responses to pathogens, so deregulated responses, insufficient responses to fight off these pathogens. You have a decline in immune capacity and so on. So these animals are very, very vulnerable to get infected by infectious pathogens. Another problem with this type of selection is genetic homogeneity. The animals nowadays are very, very, very similar. So if some animals in a farm get infected, the probability that there will be some that are different and can fight off the infection is greatly reduced. So the greater the homogeneity of the animals in terms of genetics, the greater the probability of major epidemics and pandemics as well. So just to summarize in this flowchart, These are the conditions associated with industrial animal production. And when you have genetic selection for fast growth and high productivity, first you have energy diverted from the immune function. You have low genetic diversity. You have impaired organs, the heart, the lungs, impaired heart and lung function. And this all translates into an impaired immunity, weakened immunity, which makes the conditions proper for pathogen transmission and achieving higher levels of virulence. Another very important factor that makes industrial animal farming an epidemiological risk is this. In these systems, the animals are chronically exposed to stress. When they are in confined environments, there are a number of stressors that are present that I will discuss. But as I had mentioned before, this leads to immune suppression, the weakening of the immune system. What happens? When farm animals and ourselves are exposed chronically to stress, there is the production of cortisol, which is a hormone produced by and liberated by the adrenal gland. And cortisol has a number of effects. First, it inhibits the proliferation of immune cells. It suppresses cytokine production, and cytokines are like the signaling molecules that coordinate the immune response. There's also decreased production of antibodies, and there's in general an impaired function of a number of cells, such as macrophages and natural killer cells, that are cells in the immune systems that are important to fight off infections. So you have this cascade of responses that weakens the immune system of the animals and make them very, very vulnerable to be infected. So here's a specific example of a study with pigs in a typical farm, which show that when exposed to psychosocial stress, which they all are in the conditions they are raised, there is deregulation of inflammatory processes, the impaired immune function, and an increased susceptibility to disease. Now, another problem is that when the animals are with the immune system weakened, not only are they more vulnerable to disease, but also the pathogens can multiply more easily and more quickly. So, for example, in the case of viruses, you reach very high viral loads. So the volume number of viruses is much higher, and so transmission is also much more likely. Here's an example with chickens showing that chronic exposure to corticosterone, which is also a hormone released in conditions of chronic stress, it downregulates the pro-inflammatory responses and immune function of these chickens. And finally, an example with minks, which are the small mammals also raised in very intensive industrial conditions. They are farmed not for food, but for their fur. This study showed that lack of enrichment, environmental enrichment, because these environments are completely barren, induces a number of changes, organ changes, etc., associated with impaired immunity, also making them much more vulnerable to infectious diseases. And actually, we saw that in the COVID-19 outbreak, you had a number of outbreaks of coronavirus in mink farms in Europe. So what would be typical stressors in the animal farming industry? Well, high stocking densities, as we saw, the deprivation of behaviors that animals are highly motivated to perform, such as foraging, exploration. They like to explore the environment, and they can't. Sometimes they are in cages, or density of the population is too high, or they are limited in their movements because of their genetic. They are too heavy, or they have pain, so they cannot move. Chickens cannot dust bathe. Typically, many don't have a nest to lay an egg. They cannot peck on the ground, etc., etc., etc. So there's also limited opportunities for movement, as I said. In some cases, social isolation. So, for example, in case of female pigs, used as kept in gestation crates. They cannot move, they cannot turn around, and they're socially isolated, even though they're a very social animal. Maternal deprivation, so youngsters are taken from their mothers very, very early. Short sleep periods, either because the lights are on or because they get, in the case of broilers, because of the very high density, their rest is interrupted by touching of the other birds very frequently. Limited access to sunlight, to natural light. This is also another stressor. They are frequently, most often, closed in indoor environments. And the fear and the pain associated with management practices that are very typical and widespread, such as the mutilation of body parts, so surgical castration in the case of male pigs, tail docking, teeth clipping, beak trimming, ear notching, dehorning, and so many. So going back to this picture and putting some more factors, then we have high densities, behavioral suppression. There's also poor air quality in these facilities. You have a very high number of animals, and you can imagine a very high volume of waste. And when this waste evaporates, it creates a very high concentration of ammonia in the air, which is very aversive. So in addition to the aversion it causes, it also helps to impair heart and mostly lung function. So here again, the first barriers against pathogens, the mechanical barriers in the respiratory cells of the animals because of the poor air quality are also impaired, helping impair immune function. And all these factors that I mentioned also create chronic stress, which is also associated with weakened immune function. So putting still some extra factors, the high densities facilitates pathogen transmission from one animal to the other. There's a very high contact rate. And also something that's not so discussed is that in these indoor environments with lack of sunlight and wet soils, wet floors, pathogen survival tends to be much longer. The virus, the bacteria, doesn't die so easily. So the transmission of the pathogen is facilitated. For example, in the case of influenza, the virus of the influenza virus, when it's in contact with sunlight, it's desiccated much more rapidly, and in dry environments, it's desiccated much more rapidly. So we are creating the ideal conditions for not only for the virus to multiply, for the virus to find weakened hosts, but also for the virus to survive for a very long time. And this facilitates not only transmission, but also the evolution of greater virulence, greater pathogenicity levels. So, in summary, in industrial animal farming, we have the ideal recipe, the perfect storm for the emergence of major epidemics and pandemics. We have much higher contact rates. We have much more likely and longer viral survival. We have suppressed immunity in the hosts. And we have a genetic variability that is greatly reduced. So this is ideal for the emergence of major epidemics and pandemics. Now discuss a very specific case which is associated with the risks of a pandemic of bird flu. So bird flu is a type of influenza virus, flu virus, that affects birds mostly, but has also infected humans and some other animals. And in the case of humans, the people who got infected were those that got in touch with an infected bird or with the waste of an infected bird. Now, the greatest concern is this, until now, the bird flu has not become a major epidemic or pandemic because the virus does not have the capacity to be transmitted from person to person in a sustained way. So the concern here is if the virus were to mutate in a way that made it more transmissible from person to person, and the flu could spread, it could spread very, very quickly. And this is dangerous because, different from other viruses, some strains of bird flu have a very high lethality rate, some higher than 50%. So every 10 people who get infected, 5 die. So if this were to happen and we had a pandemic of respiratory viruses that is transmissible from person to person, and with this very high fatality rate, this could lead to a collapse of civilization. With COVID-19, we had what we had, with a mortality rate, depending on the risk group, of up to 1%. And you all saw the disruption that it caused. So imagine a mortality rate of 50%. So basic services, food provisioning, sanitary services, medical services, any basic service would be completely collapse. And this is something that probably we would take a very, very, very long time to recover. So here are some highly pathogenic avian flu viruses that have infected humans. H5N1, possibly the most severe one, with a death rate of over 50%, H7N9 with a death rate of between 20 and 40%, and H5N6 with a mortality rate of 25 to 50%. So this is very, very, very high. And here just a chart showing this mortality rate in the case of H5N1 for the various countries where people were infected by this flu virus. And on average, we have that 50% of the people who got infected died. It varied from 100% in Canada, for example, because just 1 or 2 people were infected, to 0% also because the number of people infected was low, but also some more reasonable numbers in countries where more people got infected. And here some news stories showing general global concern about the spread of avian influenza recently. So cases of H5N6 in humans in China, the fast spread of bird flu outbreaks in Europe and Asia, human cases of bird flu surging in China, the largest global bird flu outbreak in history in a newspaper in France, and cases of H7N9 in Canada, in China as well. So there's general concern with the rapid spread that the flu outbreaks are having. In general, the threat of a flu pandemic is now higher because of a number of factors. First, there have been increases in the number and geographic spread of bird flu infections in birds, in the number of subtypes of bird flu viruses that have infected these birds, and in the number of species that the bird flu viruses have infected. We also have seen a number of outbreaks globally since 2020. There have been a very high number of highly pathogenic avian flu outbreaks, more outbreaks in 2020 and 2021 than in the 4 previous years combined. And over 60 countries reported the H5N1, the highly lethal outbreaks in birds. So again, reminding, why is this happening? We have the perfect recipe for highly pathogenic strains to emerge and spread rapidly. We have high contact rates, long viral survival, hosts that are immune suppressed, and low genetic variability. And it's not surprising that when studied, what researchers found is that the conversion of the flu virus from low pathogenicity, low lethality, to high pathogenicity, the genetic conversion happened predominantly in places where intensive farming, intensive bird farming was pervasive. So 36 out of the 39 events of genetic conversion of strains of low pathogenicity to high pathogenicity that were identified happened in commercial farms, in countries where intensive production prevails, or in countries transitioning to intensive production. And the concerns are not only with birds, with broiler chickens, laying hens, turkeys, etc. It's also with pigs. And in the case of pigs, there's also an additional factor that is concerning, which is this. Pigs are very, very similar, physiologically similar, anatomically similar to humans. We had insulin some decades ago from pigs being used to treat diabetes in humans. We have heart transplantation from pigs to humans, and so on. And also, the respiratory cells of pigs have receptors for the bird flu virus. They have receptors for the human flu virus, and they have receptors for the swine flu virus. So why is this concerning? Because all these viruses are able to infect the respiratory cells of pigs, and they're able to meet inside the cells. And when they meet, the conditions might be created for them to interchange genetic material. So imagine the human flu virus combining with the bird flu virus inside the cell of a pig, and the bird flu virus, a highly lethal bird flu virus, acquiring the capacity to be transmissible from person to person, which is present in the human flu virus. So this could mean a catastrophe for in terms of pandemic risk. So here we have a global map of the distribution of avian flu outbreaks in 2021 and 2022. As you can see, in just these 2 years, you have outbreaks not only in Asia, but also all over Europe, North America, Africa. It's only South America that is not present here. But this has changed this year in 2023. The PAHO now issued an alert that bird flu outbreaks are now seen in 10 countries in South America. And what is perhaps one of the most concerning things we have seen recently was an outbreak of H5N1, the severe type bird flu in minks, which is a mammal raised for their fur, in a Spanish farm. And this is not any case. The transmission in this farm was happening from mammal to mammal. So this shows that H5N1 has already achieved the capacity for sustained transmission from mammal to mammal. And again, this is not any mammal. The minks are in the same family as ferrets, which are used in flu research exactly because the flu symptoms they developed and the progression of symptoms is very similar to what happens in humans. And not surprisingly, the Spanish farm was an intensive farm where animals were confined in cages. In the US, for example, most of the poultry farms affected by the bird flu outbreaks were also intensive confinement farms. So in the case of minks, this is a red flag of what may come next. The typical answer response from the industry because of all these risks is to focus on increasing biosecurity in animal operations. But does this really work? So as mentioned here by a visiting scholar, when there's public discussion addressing zoonotic diseases in factory farms, everyone, public agents, industry, etc., almost immediately turn to vaccination, preparedness, biosecurity, etc. Let's see if it works. Although the implementation of biosecurity protocols may help, if you know how an animal production operation works, you can easily see that it's impossible to control the spread of pathogens from inside the operations to outside the operations, particularly respiratory pathogens such as flu. First of all, you have the ventilation system, which pushes air out of the facilities, and with this, the viruses. Research has shown that you find viruses in near closed animal operations with very strict biosecurity protocols, 100 meters, 200 meters outside, far from these facilities. Also, you have the use of waste from the animals as fertilizer in other regions. You have insects, rodents that get in and out of the facilities. You have personnel, you have equipment, you have garbage that takes the pathogens out of the facility. You have the carcasses of dead animals that died before slaughter that are also taken out of the facilities. You have the live animals that are sent to the slaughterhouses, or they are sent abroad in very long journeys. So how do you control the spread of respiratory pathogen in a truck or in a boat? So it's extremely difficult to control it, even if biosecurity protocols were strictly implemented. And we know that they aren't. Everywhere where this was studied, even in countries such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway, etc., in every place this was studied, there were breaches of biosecurity that were found. So it's impossible actually to control the spread of pathogens to outside the facilities, particularly if they are respiratory pathogens. And this is something the industry itself recognizes. This is a slogan from the industry, which says that a small risk repeated 1,000 times becomes a big risk. I would add that the risk is not small, and it's repeated much more than 1,000 times. So this becomes a major risk. And let's remember that even in high security labs, in the best universities, in the US, in European countries, we have very high number of incidents. So if the escape of viruses cannot be controlled, even under these extremely strict conditions, let alone in thousands and thousands of farms spread all over the globe. It doesn't matter if there's high biosecurity in a state or in a country. If another country doesn't have it, then the problem, the local problem, as I mentioned, becomes a global problem. So this is extremely difficult to control, if not impossible. And when we see these concerns with bird flu, frequently we also see news such as this, that free-range eggs are no longer available and that people should not have backyard birds, etc. And this idea is based on a major epidemiological mistake, which is to focus on transmission, which, as we are discussing, it's impossible to control at the large scale needed, instead of better immunity. So we have seen that conversion to highly pathogenic strains are inherently tied to industrial animal farming conditions. And on the contrary, the animals in this alternative extensive type of system usually have better genetics, are more resilient to disease, etc. So the mistake of trying to control a virus, a respiratory viruses, is a widespread one, and when the focus should be really on making animals and people more resilient to disease, not never in contact with a pathogen. And it may be clear by now that live animal transportation is a major epidemiological risk. Every year we have over 2 billion animals loaded onto ships and trucks and sent on journeys, national, international, that may last from 25 hours up to weeks in the case of animals sent abroad. And as you know, high contact rates, high density, high levels of acute stress in these trips. The animals are without water, without food, exposed to cold stress, to heat stress. Sometimes they are fractured, they are wounded, they have fear. So the level of immune suppression, the weakening of the immune system is very pronounced, giving the opportunity for pathogens to multiply very rapidly, to be released in their waste as well. There's also a mix of populations of animals from different farms, from different regions. So the possibility of mixing of the genetic material of these pathogens is also very high. And this again is a very good recipe for pathogen transmission and the emergence of new ones. This is a global map of the live swine trade. So they are also sent live to many countries. And it's interesting that these authors mention that the following: wild waterfowl have long been considered the most important reservoir host and pandemic risk to influenza. But mammals are emerging as key reservoirs too. Modernization of swine production during the last half century provided new opportunities for influenza A viruses to become established in swine globally. So, pandemic preparedness efforts must be based on the notion, first, that it's extremely difficult to predict which pathogen will cause the next pandemic. We have been trying to do that and in the epidemiological community, and we have failed time and again. How this pathogen will behave, when and where it will emerge, or two, it's extremely difficult to control transmission once it emerges. So more than predicting the next pandemic, it's necessary to identify and mitigate those factors that make us vulnerable to new pandemics and epidemics. And intensive animal farming is first on that list. So thank you very much. I hope you found the information here useful and interesting. If you need further information, you can find it in the 2 books I mentioned at the beginning. There you also have the scientific references for the evidence I mentioned. And also in the address at the bottom, welfarefootprint.org/material, you can download the figures and the pictures that were in the slides freely. Thank you.